Necromancer has never had as much build diversity as it does in Season 3, and sometimes it can get hard to keep track of all these different builds and exactly where all of them rank relative to each other. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 10 different in-game builds, and we're going to be going over their Nightmare Dungeon clear speed, as well as their ability to kill Duriel, and we're going to compare all these builds against each other and talk about their strengths and weaknesses and where they all rank against each other. If you don't know, my name is Ruse. I'm in charge of all the Necro videos here. This is the face behind the voice, and if you don't like this format, let me know and I won't do it again, but I thought we would give it a try. So to start, let's talk about everyone's favorite, or least favorite build, Bone Spear. Bone Spear is extremely powerful. It crushes in single target, it destroys Duriel, it can speed farm any Uber boss with ease. The only downside of Bone Spear is it doesn't have quite the AoE damage that some of the other builds bring. This is because the size of the Bone Spear itself is not that large, which when you're comparing it to something like Sever or Blood Surge, it can actually be slower in Nightmare Dungeons. Overall though, Bone Spear is definitely an S tier build, and when we compare it to other builds, you're going to see it stacks up extremely well. Now let's talk about a build that does not stack up extremely well, which is Pure Summoner Necromancer. Pure Summoner is just a step behind every other build that we're going to talk about today. Its damage output is just too low. It can't bring the same movement speed because it can't run movement speed on its boots so much, and overall it is just an inferior build compared to the other builds we're going to talk about today. But that being said, I don't want to put it in D tier because it can still do Nightmare 100, it can still do Duriel, like it can clear all of the content in the game, and that's kind of what makes this tier list awkward. The main difference between a top tier build and a low tier build is actually just going to be the speed at which it can do it and the ease of which it can do it. In which case, Pure Summoner, slower, harder than Bone Spear. Next, let's talk about a very powerful build, Sever. So, I've already covered Sever on this channel, and Sever crushes. It is so fast at Nightmare 100, and even against Duriel, it does pretty damn well. It kills Duriel in about 25 seconds, and for Nightmare 100 dungeons, it's about 10% faster than Bone Spear. Overall, these builds are very close to each other, and what I would say is to play Bone Spear if you're more focused on single target, and to play Sever if you're more interested in a well-balanced build. So how does Bloodlance stack up against all of these builds? I would say Bloodlance is a solid A tier build. It has a lot of damage, like an incredible amount of damage, but the problem it has is it takes too long to get that damage out. Builds like Sever and Bone Spear can just walk up, do their damage, and then they kill everything and they're done. Bloodlance has to walk up to a pack and do its ramp and do the whole setup before it can get its damage out, and this makes the build a lot slower. Against Duriel with the right setup, Bloodlance is actually incredibly fast at killing Duriel, so it is going to be the top of A tier, but it's not quite going to break into the S tier because of how slow it is in Nightmare Dungeons, and it's still slower than Bone Spear on Duriel. Now, Blood Surge is an interesting build to evaluate, because it really depends on whether you put more weight onto Nightmare Dungeons or more weight into Duriel for how we will rank this build. Personally, I rank it very high. I put it into S tier, because it can still kill Duriel in about 25 seconds, which is faster than some builds but slower than the top two builds. And for Nightmare Dungeons, it is so much faster than the other builds. It is ludicrous how fast Blood Surge is because of its gigantic size of its AoE, as well as the ridiculous damage it does with Overpower. Blood Surge is a build that can crush Nightmare 100, and when we see the Gauntlet come out, I would not be surprised if all of the top players play Blood Surge. So this puts Blood Surge for me as a solid S tier build, though it is lacking in single target. Its Nightmare 100 clear speed more than makes up for it. Next, let's talk about a build that was initially evaluated insanely highly, but ended up kind of falling down a few paces as things went on, which is Bone Spirit. So I think that Bone Spirit is still an A tier build, and here's why. With Bisque gear, Bone Spirit still one-shots bosses just like it used to, but the problem that Bone Spirit has is that when you're doing 4-man runs, which is the meta for bossing, it cannot get as much damage out as a build like Bone Spear. So while it can technically destroy bosses when you're farming solo, in group play it's going to underperform, and you're going to see a similar thing in Nightmare Dungeons. While it will mostly one-shot enemies in Nightmare Dungeons, it requires more setup. It's more close to Bloodlance in terms of you having to set it up. You have to get the corpse tendrils out, you got to pull enemies into a pile, and then you one-shot everything. by the time you've done that, the S tier builds are already on to the next pack. So I think if there was more difficult content, we would see Bone Spirit higher rated, and it's probably the easiest build to do Nightmare 100 in terms of ease of assembling the build, but it just doesn't quite stack up to the other builds in the end game. Okay, next we're going to talk about Infinimist. So Infinimist is either bottom of A or top of B, depending on your perspective, which sucks, you know, because a lot of us know Infinimist used to be our best build. So what happened? Well, the nerfs to the lucky hit actually ended up doing a tremendous amount of damage to this build. They nerfed the lucky hit chance of corpse explosion. So hued flesh is a huge part of Infinimist, which gives you a chance on hit to spawn corpses, right? And it no longer procs as frequently from corpse explosion. And because of this, this mostly actually hurts our single target. Our single target damage on Infinimist has plummeted. On top of that, because all of the builds this season do so much damage, the damage over time aspect of Infinimist makes it really struggle in Nightmare 100 clear speed. While it clears Nightmare 100 like free, it's a breeze to clear it, it is slower than the other builds because it has to ramp, which, and you're going to see this with a lot of the lower tier builds. Most of what makes them worse is the fact that their damage takes time to get out, whereas the top tier builds can do their damage right away. The other problem Infinimist has is its single target. It just lacks the raw damage that is needed to just destroy bosses. There's some stuff you can do to make it better, but it's never going to stack up against the S tier or really even the A tier builds. But it can clear everything, so it's still a playable build, but it's just not quite at the same level. Next, let's talk about Mindeln minions. I love this build. I think Mindeln and minions in general, well, Pierce Summoner sucks, but Mindeln minions is an extremely solid build. I would actually rate it above Bone Spirit. This is because with the minions, with the Mindeln procs, right? If you haven't seen my video, you're basically just running around spamming Bone Spears, proccing Mindeln, and then your minions just one-shot everything with gigantic AoE. And the reason why this is so powerful is because the minions' attacks don't consume the Mindeln unless they actually connect to a target. What this means is whenever you get to a pack, you proc the Mindeln, your minions kill the pack, you start running to the next one, your minions still have the Mindeln effect, and they're going to be one-shotting trash as you move. This makes them incredibly fast for Nightmare 100, though again, not quite at the same level as the S tier builds, definitely faster at Nightmare 100 than Bloodlance or Bone Spirit. The thing that probably makes it worse than Bloodlance is its single target. Mindeln can crush Lilith, it'll crush Duriel, about 20-25 seconds. The right Bloodlance build can kill those boss in a couple of seconds. So Mindeln, I think, is definitely behind Bloodlance, but it's certainly above Bone Spirit. The next build we're going to talk about is XFalls Corpse Explosion, which I know a lot of people probably think is very similar to the Infinimist Corpse Explosion, but your stat priorities, your gear builds, everything is different with these two builds. But XFalls struggles for a lot of the same reasons why Infinimist struggles. So XFalls is all about putting out a ton of dots and then getting lucky hit to do gigantic AoE damage. Now, the problem you run into is twofold. First of all, you actually have to get the lucky hit procs to do your damage, which, when you're speed farming compared to the S tier and even the A tier builds, having to rely on RNG to do your damage is just painful. Like, you're sitting there sometimes on a pack of 5 mobs just waiting and waiting and waiting for the XFalls procs, and this can really slow down the build. The other problem it has is that it just doesn't bring the single target damage that these other builds can bring. It takes a while to kill bosses. So ultimately, what you're left with is a build that isn't consistent enough to speed farm Nightmare 100 and doesn't quite have the damage to speed farm bosses either. But it can still do it, right? And this is the problem I have with like kind of the tier list these days. All of these builds can beat everything. It's just a matter of ease. Okay, so the last build. Now, if you haven't seen the Bombardier build, Operator Otter's build, you should definitely check it out. I have a link to his build in the description. This build is incredibly powerful, and here's why. It has a lot of the strength of Bone Spear while being slightly slower in single target, but it packs an incredible area of effect damage punch. So ultimately, it ends up performing very similarly, if not better than Sever in single target, while performing better than a build like Sever in AoE, or at least close to it. And I would put these builds at an extremely close level. I think you could argue for any of these 3 builds to be number 1 over the other, but I think ultimately it's going to look something like this. All 3 of those builds absolutely dominate. both single target and AoE, and then you have Blood Surge, which is even better in AoE, but can't quite pack the single target, and then you have the lower tier builds. Now, just to reiterate one more time, all of these builds can do all the content. Pick your favorite build and enjoy it. But if you're looking for more context for what the best builds are, this is that context. This is where I would rate all the builds as we stand right now. And yeah, I hope you guys liked the video. Like I said, let me know in the comments what you think of this format. If you disliked it, let me know. If you liked it, let me know. And thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.